Atlanta, June 15th, 2026. Group H, Spain versus Cape Verde. Spain arrived as one of the favourites to win the entire tournament, ranked second in the world. A squad stacked with players who had grown up inside the best academies Europe had to offer. Barcelona's La Masia, Real Madrid's youth system, players who had been identified as special before they were even teenagers and fast-tracked through every level of development football could offer them. Cape Verde arrived ranked 67th, a nation of roughly 500,000 people, playing in their first ever World Cup match in the history of the country. And standing in goal for Cape Verde was a 40-year-old man who had not turned professional until he was 25 years old, an age when most of the players he was about to face had already signed their first major sponsorship deals. His name was Yosimar José Evora Dias. The world knew him as Vozinha. For 90 minutes he made the most talented attacking players Spanish football could produce look completely ordinary. 27 shots, 7 saves. Pedri denied. Ferran Torres denied. Aymeric Laporte denied. Even Lamine Yamal, the most hyped attacking talent in Europe, came off the bench and found absolutely nothing. Final score 0-0. When the whistle blew, Vozinha collapsed near his own goal and wept. But to understand why that moment carried the emotional weight it did, to understand why a 40-year-old goalkeeper from a second-division Portuguese club cried like that on the world's biggest stage, you have to go back decades to a place far from any World Cup stadium, where the real opponent of Vozinha's career first appeared. That opponent was never one man. It was an entire system that told him, for almost 2 decades, that he simply did not belong. São Vicente, Cape Verde, an island off the western coast of Africa with a population of roughly 70,000 people. This was where Yosimar Dias grew up. Raised primarily by his grandparents because his father was serving in the military and his mother worked constantly just to keep the household running. Football on this island was not played in academies with manicured pitches and qualified youth coaches. It was played in the street, and the street did not care how old you were supposed to be before you competed. In my neighbourhood, the boys were much older. Vozinha later told FIFA, I always played in the street, getting beaten up a lot. I was also very good with my feet. I was competitive and rebellious. I didn't like to lose. I took a lot of hits. These were not casual kickabouts. These were older, bigger, physically dominant boys who showed no mercy toward a smaller child trying to compete in their games. Vozinha lost constantly. He took hits constantly. And when he could not get his own back against opponents who were simply bigger and stronger than he was, he would go home angry, sulking, and complain to the grandparents who were raising him. The other boys noticed, and they turned it into mockery. They would tease me, saying I was going to complain to my grandparents, he later admitted. The Portuguese word for that, Vozinha, meaning little granny, became the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, eventually printed on the back of a World Cup jersey decades later. That nickname was born directly from defeat, from being repeatedly overpowered by people who had every physical advantage over him and refused to let him forget it. This was the first opponent of his career, not a specific player, not a specific team, an entire group of older boys who had decided collectively that he did not measure up and who made sure he knew it every single day he showed up to play. The pattern did not end in childhood. It followed him directly into the structure of professional football itself, a system that, in its own way, repeated exactly what those older boys had done, just with scouts and academy directors instead of street bullies. Vozinha was good, genuinely good. By his own account and by the accounts of those who watched him develop on São Vicente, he was one of the best goalkeepers on the entire island as a teenager, but he was small. "I was one of the best keepers on my island, but I was small," he later explained. Goalkeeping, more than almost any other position in football, has historically rewarded height and physical presence above almost everything else. Coaches and scouts looking for the next generation of professional keepers were trained to look first at size, and a talented but undersized teenager from a tiny island nation with no professional academy infrastructure was an easy player to overlook. So, they overlooked him, year after year. While other goalkeepers his age, taller, more conventionally built, often from countries with established academy pipelines, were signed, developed, and fast-tracked into professional contracts, Vozinha waited. He kept playing. He kept being good. And the system that was supposed to identify talent kept walking past him because he did not fit the physical profile it had decided mattered most. He did not turn professional until the age of 25, joining obscure local side Batuque in 2007, the same year that future Spanish wonder kid Lamine Yamal would be born. By the time the system finally let him in the door, an entire generation of conventionally sized goalkeepers had already been given a decade-long head start that Vozinha would never fully recover in terms of reputation or recognition. "I started playing professional football when I was 25 years old," he said. "It was too late for a person like me." That sentence carries an entire childhood and adolescence of rejection inside it. What followed was not a story of overnight success once the door finally opened. It was 19 more years of being treated as an afterthought by a sport that had already decided what kind of player deserved real opportunity. Vozinha's career became one of the most nomadic journeys in modern football. Angola with Progresso de Sambizanga, Moldova with Zimbru Chisinau, Portugal with Gil Vicente, Cyprus with AEL Limassol, 5 years there, the longest stable stretch of his career. Slovakia, briefly, with AS Trenčín. Eventually back to Portugal's second division with Chaves, the club he was still playing for as the 2026 World Cup approached. 9 clubs, 5 countries. Over 200 matches across a career that statistics providers have not even fully tracked because nobody considered his journey important enough to document completely. 1 trophy in 19 years, the 2018-19 Cypriot Cup with AEL Limassol. No Champions League nights, no superstar contracts. No academy spotlight ever turning back to reconsider the small kid from São Vicente that it had dismissed decades earlier. And at one particularly difficult point, after losing his place in the Cape Verde national team during a disappointing Africa Cup of Nations qualifying campaign, Vozinha seriously considered walking away from international football entirely. "It was a very hard time," he admitted. "I was thinking of stopping with the national team. All my teammates talked to me. They encouraged me to stay because of the World Cup. I stayed because of that, because it was my dream, the dream of all of us." Even his own federation, even the qualifying campaigns themselves, had given him reasons to believe the door he had fought his entire adolescence to open might be closing again permanently before he ever got the validation he had spent a lifetime chasing. So, when Cape Verde finally qualified for their first ever World Cup, when the third smallest nation ever to reach the tournament booked their place on the global stage, the goalkeeper, standing in their net, carried every single one of those rejections onto the pitch with him. Every older boy on that street in São Vicente who had laughed at him, every scout who had walked past a talented teenager because he did not look the part, every year between 18 and 25 when his career should have been beginning and instead simply was not allowed to, every nomadic transfer to a country most football fans could not locate on a map, because that was the level of opportunity a system that undervalued him was willing to offer. And on June 15th, 2026, facing Spain, facing players who had received every advantage that Vozinha had spent his entire life being denied, he made 7 saves that ensured none of it mattered anymore. Marc Cucurella tried, Marcos Llorente tried, Fabian Ruiz tried something different, Mikel Oyarzabal tried a trick of his own. Lamine Yamal, the academy product who represented everything the system had prioritized over players like Vozinha, came on as a substitute and found nothing at all. None of it worked. When the final whistle sounded, Vozinha did not celebrate the way a man might celebrate a famous result. He collapsed near his own goalpost and cried, and the explanation he gave afterward revealed exactly who he was thinking about in that moment. "I cried because I grew up with my grandparents, and unfortunately they were not here," he said. "They died a few years before, and they did everything for me and my life. Also, my mum. She didn't manage to be here because of the visa. The money for the visa we didn't manage on time, and I would like her to be here." The grandparents who had raised him while he ran home angry from street football defeats. The mother who had worked constantly so he could chase a dream that the entire football world had spent decades telling him was unrealistic for someone his size, starting his career at his age, coming from a country with his resources. None of them were there to see the moment that finally, definitively, settled the argument the sport had been having about him since he was a child on São Vicente. His Instagram following went from roughly 50,000 before kickoff to over 14 million within days. Brazilian and Portuguese broadcasters who had never previously mentioned his name were suddenly asking for interviews. Paul Pogba publicly praised him on social media. Coaches and analysts who had walked past him for 2 decades were now studying his positioning, his shot stopping, his game reading as a model worth examining. The system that had ignored him for 19 professional years finally had no choice but to look. "I would tell 18-year-old Vozinha to be really proud of himself," he said after the match. "I have worked my whole life for this moment. I'm 40 years old. I started playing football professionally when I was 25, in 2012. I thought about leaving, but I continued because of this dream." There was no single man Vozinha defeated that night in Atlanta, no defender he tackled, no rival striker he outdueled in a personal grudge match built over years of direct confrontation. What he defeated was something far larger and far older than any individual opponent, a collective judgment formed in childhood and reinforced by every scout, every academy, every missed opportunity across 19 years of professional football that told him repeatedly he simply did not have what the game was looking for. The older boys on that street in São Vicente were the first to deliver that verdict. The scouts who overlooked a talented but undersized teenager delivered it next. And an entire football ecosystem structured around finding the next prodigy at 16 rather than the next late bloomer at 25 delivered it for nearly 2 decades after that. Vozinha hated being underestimated by all of them, more than he hated any single rival who ever stood across from him on a football pitch. And on a Monday afternoon in Atlanta, at 40 years old, in front of the entire football-watching world, he finally made every single one of them watch. There is a detail in his story that makes the entire arc even more striking. The fact that his given name was almost a tribute to greatness from the very beginning, long before anyone could have known what he would eventually become. His father, Zé Pedro, had wanted to name him Valdano, after the Argentine striker Jorge Valdano, who had starred alongside Diego Maradona during Argentina's victorious 1986 World Cup campaign. Cape Verde's registry officials rejected the name at the time, ruling that foreign names of that kind were not permitted. The family turned instead to Josimar, a Brazilian fullback from that same 1986 tournament, whose attacking runs had made him one of the breakout stars of that World Cup. So even his official name carried a connection to football greatness on the world's biggest stage, a coincidence that meant nothing for nearly 4 decades, until a 40-year-old man wearing that same name finally walked onto a World Cup pitch of his own and delivered a performance worthy of the comparison his father had once tried to make. The nickname that the street gave him, Vozinha, Little Granny, born from mockery and defeat, ended up being the name that mattered. Not because the older boys who coined it were right about him, but because he carried it all the way to the one stage that could finally prove, decisively and completely, exactly how wrong they had been. Cape Verde's population is roughly 500,000 people. By the time Vozinha's press duties were finished after the Spain match, his personal social media following had grown larger than the population of his entire home country. A small boy who used to run home from street football matches in tears, mocked for needing his grandparents' comfort, had become the player an entire continent pointed to as proof that the games people decide you have already lost in childhood are never actually the final score